We've called our day today together for National Threatened Species Day at home in Whittlesea's Grasslands. So there are plenty of really built up urban places in the city of Whittlesea, and it is just fantastic. We have two pictures on that opening slide. One you would have seen on Instagram, and the other is of that big open plain looking out there on a day where it's just all that dapple cloudy light. And of course, it's not a forest. These are grasslands. We're on the eastern edge of the Victorian volcanic plain here. Okay, so where are we? I'm just trying to establish that with you, but this is a slide that can amuse people sometimes when we see that many people have been around the world or around Australia, but they haven't been to Galata Tambor. So it's we're not in Africa, we're not in Kakadu, we're not in Uluru, we're not in the Great Barrier Reef. We're right there, and when we're at Galata Tambor, the area is split by Mary Creek, and on one side we're in Campbellfield, and on the other side we're in Thomastown. So you'll know those suburban areas, but you mightn't have heard of Galata Tambor. Now, Galata Tambor is renamed in those words. That's Woiwurrung language. Some of you are going to know that as the language of the Wurundjeri people, because we're on Wurundjeri country when we're here along the Mary Creek. And today, of course, we're talking to you in just that we've come to the end of that last Woiwurrung season, which is known as Guling, which is around August. And now we're just right into Porneet, which goes between September and October. And paying attention to those seasons really changes the way you experience life in Wurundjeri country, because it makes sense. Like the moment we hit August, everything is so different. You get that flowering, and of course, Mary, we have other remnants of Woiwurrung language to remind us of the language that's pretty well gone to sleep, but being woken up by Wurundjeri educators like Mandy Nicholson, Uncle Dave Wandon, Uncle Bill Nicholson. And we know that Mary, the word Mary in Mary Creek means rocky. And it sure is a rocky place because we're on that eastern edge of the Victorian volcanic plain. And Michael will talk to you more about that history of that volcanic and geological history of that lava flowing down through here. And of course, as it cooled, it became very rocky. And just a word here about Mary Creek Management Committee. Michael and I work for Mary Creek Management Committee. I'll introduce Michael and Josh to you a little bit further down, but they're joining in our webinar today. And as a not-for-profit organisation, our job is to promote, protect and restore the Indigenous flora and fauna of the Mary Creek catchment. And we're always keeping it in mind that we're on Wurundjeri country. Okay, so the presenters that we've got with us today are going to share stories about the plants and animals that we like to think about, particularly on National Threatened Species Day. But it is really wonderful to have this context, have this place in the city of Whittlesea. Thinking about those stories of plants and animals is one thing, you know, quite wonderful to think of a plant and an animal at any time because we're nature lovers. But when you think about them at Galata Tambor then, and you realise just how close you might be, you can get out there sometime and go for a walk. And we'll talk more about that later. So I'm going to ask everyone to turn off their microphones and their screens. And we are recording today, so if you need to be okay with that, we've got someone external recording this for us. And I think what I'll do is I'll offer, when I stop sharing my screen, Michael Longmore, who's the manager of our ecological restoration program for Mary Creek Management Committee, Michael's going to take you through a number of slides. So I'm going to switch my screen so that Michael is handling things, and I'm going to be watching the chat bar. So if anyone's got any questions, please use the chat bar. And I'll refer a couple of those over to Michael as we go along. I hope that feels good to you. And I think after we'll have Michael talking to us for about 30 minutes. When Michael's finished, then I'm going to introduce Josh Cox. He is the director of a marvellous company called Reptile Encounters. And Mary Creek Management Committee and Reptile Encounters have come together over the years for quite a lot of occasions. And this is a really special one because we've never done a webinar before. And you'll see Josh is set up at home with his animals and is going to just, you know, show you some lovely wiggling creatures. Some have got long tails, some have got beady eyes, and we're just going to have a lovely time together today. So I hope you really enjoy this. As I said, we're going to be recording it, and it will go up on Mary Creek Management Committee's website, probably about later on during the week to come. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now and let you go to Michael.
So, hi everybody. My name is Michael Longmore. I manage the Ecological Restoration Program at Mary Creek Management Committee, and I'm going to be taking you through, we'll be exploring Galata Tambor via digital means today. We can't go out there in the flesh, obviously, or not as a group anyway, but we're hoping to wander around. I'll show you some of the plants, some of the geological features, and talk a bit about the I guess the ecological and social history of this place. Yeah, look at what makes Galata Tambor special, and yeah, try and encourage you all to come out there and explore it of your own accord and get involved to help us protect some of the threatened plants and animals that Galata Tambor is home to. So I guess best place to start is if we were actually at Galata Tambor, if we were at the Whittlesea Public Gardens, we'd be wandering across the bridge over the Hume Freeway into the wide open space on the western side of the freeway. Before we actually do that walk online, we'll do a bit of a walk back through time. We're actually in an extremely ancient landscape here in the Mary Creek, but also a really new one as well. So that's a bit weird. But Galata Tambor, or the Mary Creek Valley itself, if we were to travel back 400 million years into the past, so a very long way back, we'd actually be underwater. At that point in time, this part of Victoria was at the bottom of a shallow sea. So we're deep below the water. There's lots of the things that you'd expect to see on the bottom of the sea, lots of sand, lots of sediment, that's all sinking down to the bottom. And the sheer weight of the water and the sheer weight of sediment means that eventually turns into rock. So slowly over the intervening 400 million years, the seas receded and those rocks came to the surface, and they formed rocks called sandstones and siltstones and mudstones. And if you go down to Galata Tambor today, you can actually see where the creek, down in the gorge, south of Barry Road, where the creek has cut through and exposed those sandstones, those rocks left over from these wetter times. So over the last 400 million years, there's been a lot of rain and plants and different things to weather the rocks and slowly chew them down. And so the ancient Mary Creek carved its way through those sandstones, but it actually did that in a different spot to where the Mary Creek is today. So it didn't follow quite the same path. We think the ancient Mary Creek was actually a few kilometres further to the west, sort of over near where Sydney Road is now. What we've actually got here is showing one of the more recent developments in the Mary Creek Valley. So I mentioned how the Mary Creek used to be a bit further across towards the west. When we get into much more modern time, and so I'm talking about 1 million years ago, but this same sort of process I'm about to explain is still happening right now in other parts of Victoria. We entered a period of intense volcanic activity. So you can see the hill here in my photo, that's Bald Hill up in Calchello. But for those of you living elsewhere in the city of Whittlesea, you might have seen Hayes Hill, a similar sort of hill just poking up out of the flat surrounding plains. That's Hayes Hill's up on Donnybrook Road, and there's other hills like Mount Ridley behind Craigieburn, Mount Fraser up at Beveridge. These are all actually extinct volcanoes. So in the last couple of million years around Melbourne, we entered this period called the New Volcanic Period, where lots of volcanoes started popping up all over the place. They're not the sort of volcanoes that, you know, we think of today when we see, you know, mountains erupting in Indonesia and that Pacific ring. So they're not the same sort of big explosive things that keep on erupting again and again and go dormant and keep on erupting. These are sort of single-use volcanoes. They'd pop up and vent their lava. The lava would flow across the landscape, and then eventually they'd stop, and that would be it. And then another volcano would pop up somewhere else. So in the last couple of million years, the northern suburbs of Melbourne had all these volcanoes popping up and spreading their lava out, and that lava trickled down through the old Mary Creek Valley and through the old Darebin Valley, and it largely filled those creeks in, and the lava moved all the way down into the city, where it hit the Yarra River down at Dights Falls, or where Dights Falls is now, and it actually plugged the Yarra up for a time, and so there was all those floodplains up around Warrandyte area formed because of this backed up Yarra. Eventually the Yarra burst through and started flowing again, and sort of began to resemble what we think of now when we see the Yarra. But yeah, the northern suburbs, all the lower parts in the landscape got covered in this lava, and eventually that lava cooled down, and slowly rain, plants, animals, wind, those things helped to break those rocks down. Those rocks are called basalt, and if you've wandered along the Mary Creek, you would have seen some of these grey basalt boulders, which are the cooled lava. And on top of that basalt, as it slowly got weathered, we started to get these really rich, fresh volcanic soils. If you happen to live in the area and you've been outside and seen the soil around, you've seen these really dark grey to black clays. And you might have noticed in summertime, you get big cracks forming in those clays as they dry out. And then in winter, of course, it becomes incredibly boggy. Those cracks close up as the soil swells with the rain. And yeah, you can get stuck in there quite easily if you're not careful. So those clays, heavy cracking clays, moved across the landscape. Those clays tended to favour not the usual trees that we expect to see growing everywhere, but because the clays crack and expand and shrink and expand as they dry out and get wet, plants like trees which have big woody root systems, they found it kind of hard to grow there. They could still grow in some places, but the basalt clays tended to favour plants with fibrous root systems, so grasses and lilies and all these smaller things. They had a much easier time on these clays. And so eventually we started to get these grassy ecosystems forming throughout northern Melbourne, but also further west. So that same volcanic activity continued all the way to the South Australian border, across this Victorian volcanic plain. I was saying before that it was about 1 million years ago we were getting eruptions here around Melbourne, but eruptions have been much more recent further west. So down at Mount Gambier, which is at the western side of the volcanic plain, there were eruptions as recently as 15,000 years ago, and other places like Tower Hill down near Warrnambool erupted about 35,000 years ago, when humans were living there. So some of Aboriginal stories from those areas actually describe these volcanic events, so people were there to witness these things happening. And geologists say that we're still in a period of active volcanic activity, so at some point, sooner or later in the next few thousand years, there'll be another eruption somewhere in Victoria. So that's something to look forward to. So yes, grassy plains. The cracking clays favoured these grasses, and the primary one is that you can see here in the front of this picture, this big tall thing called kangaroo grass, those sort of orangey flower heads coming up there. So these grasslands extended across most of this Western Victorian volcanic plain. Although they were dominated by grasses like kangaroo grasses and wallaby grasses, spear grasses, hundreds of other plants also growed in the gaps amongst the grasses. So lots of different orchids, different lilies, different daisies. A really vibrant, diverse ecosystem started to form on these plains. So around Melbourne, obviously, these were starting to form in the last million years. Aboriginal people, so the ancestors of the Wurundjeri, started to live in this area. We're not sure exactly when they came to the Melbourne area, but at least 15,000 years ago, people have been living around Melbourne, and probably much longer than that. These plains, being so full of lots of different plants and animals, provided the perfect home for people to live on. And so Aboriginal people learnt how to manage these grassy plains and through different ways. So a lot of the herbs that grew in amongst the grass tussocks had really nice, beautiful, starchy root systems, tubers and taproots that could be dug up and eaten. Some of the grasses themselves, seeds could be harvested and could be made into breads and fermented and different things like that. And of course, lots of animals lived in these grasslands as well. Lots of different birds and reptiles, but also kangaroos and wallabies, those larger mammals that we're all familiar with as well. And a variety of different bird life, insects, all sorts of things living on all these flowers, grasses, and the few trees that were still scattered around in different parts of the landscape. So Aboriginal people lived on the land, and the way that they managed the land helped to shape these grasslands as well. One of the key components to managing of Aboriginal land management was fire. Aboriginal people would burn parts of the landscape to open up fresh growth, so to make the grasses send out green shoots, which would encourage certain animals to come in and feed. But Aboriginal people would also burn the landscape to help rejuvenate grasslands. So kangaroo grass, which we saw in the picture just before, if it's left to its own devices, it can, after a few years, it can start to fill everything else in. It'll shade out all the other herbs growing in the gaps, and eventually it can choke the grassland out. But by burning, the Wurundjeri ancestors were able to get rid of all that dead growth and stop the kangaroo grass choking everything else out, opening up lots of gaps amongst the grass tussocks that would promote all these other vibrant herbs and flowers and lilies that Aboriginal people would use for food. And
Michael, I've got a question here.
Yeah, sure.
Someone has asked, do you know of works using birds or rodents as bioindicators of conservation of these native fields?
Yeah, I guess the Wurundjeri Council have put together a lot of resources looking at some of the different plants and animals and as bioindicators of season, I guess. So a way that you can work out where you are in time by seeing how different flowers are responding and different birds migrating and those sorts of things. Is that kind of what you meant?
I think that's a great answer. And someone else had asked about bluestone and basalt, you know, what's the relationship there? So I suppose we, when we do talk about basalt, that's more the sort of geological way of talking about the old, cold, hard lava. Mm-hmm. And bluestone is more the word that's used by when we start talking about how to construct and build with basalt. But yeah, it's the same material.
No, that's exactly right. So bluestone is basalt that's been quarried basically and broken up into hewn bricks and slabs and things, which sort of leads on to where we are now, I guess. So this fire and other practices like digging and those sorts of things, Aboriginal practices were helping to sustain these grasslands. But we get closer into our current period in time, we see even more changes starting to happen. So Melbourne, being colonised in the 1830s, had big changes for these grasslands and for the Wurundjeri people who were managing them. These rich new soils that had formed from this recent volcanic activity were really nutrient rich, so they were a perfect sort of place to crop things. They produced really nutritious grasslands, which were great food for cattle and for sheep. So sheep were brought in really early after Melbourne was colonised, and quickly spread throughout the western district of Victoria. And sheep loved a lot of the lilies and herbs and daisies, even more than Aboriginal people did. Some plants, such as the yam daisies, some of the early explorers mentioned seeing them by the million across the landscape, with Aboriginal people busily digging and cultivating. Sheep really loved the yam daisies, and within a decade or so had decimated them. Closer to Melbourne, of course, we started to use, houses started to be built, and large areas of the Merri Creek were actually quarried for so that basalt could be turned into bluestone slabs for use in construction. Some of the bluestone also ended up as dry stone walls, and you can actually see some of those old dry stone walls at Gallardo, where they were used to help contain both to contain livestock, but also to mark out where one person's property started and one person's property ended. So that's one of the big changes that came with colonisation. Aboriginal people had been custodians of the land, but nobody owned it as such. But with colonisation came these different types of social relationships. So suddenly land belonged to certain individuals and different entities and things, and you needed ways to mark that out. So dry stone walls were one way of marking out your boundary, but also hedges were as well. And so Europeans introduced different types of plants that weren't natural to this landscape to provide hedges as barriers to keep sheep in place. So some of these plants we might see in some of these slides, gorse and boxthorn, big prickly sort of monsters that we did a really good job at stopping people moving from one spot to another, but also do a really good job of choking out the grasslands.
Before you leave the topic of fire, if this is, we're in the porneet season now in Moirang terms, so it's windy, it's a little bit wetter, we get fluctuations in temperature, birds are nesting. Is this a good season for burning?
Not really, because it's still so wet. You'll struggle to actually get a fire going. But also, a lot of the plants are starting to just come into flower at the moment. So if you were to burn at the moment, you'd disrupt those plants and stop them from producing seed, and so it would make them less likely to survive in the longer term. So Aboriginal people were really particular about the timing of their burns. They wouldn't burn. Some areas they might burn, fairly repeatedly to try and promote certain plants. Other areas might get left for long periods of time because some things couldn't handle that regular frequency of fire. And the timing of burns, seasonal, that was really key, making sure that the burns weren't going to be detrimental to the plants they were trying to protect.
Okay, and would you say, Michael, that the burns, could you say then what months of the year the burns and our grasslands are more typically sort of suited, and to what extent are they ecological burns and to what extent are they cultural burns?
So I guess ecological burns are a much more modern thing that's started to be done in the last couple of decades, where conservation groups and public authorities have realised these grasslands are terribly endangered and they need fire. That's an essential part of looking after them. Ecological burns tend to happen either in late spring, once the water's disappeared and the grass has started to dry out, or they happen in early autumn when we've just come out of that huge fire danger period, but things haven't really started to green back up just yet. So in the Merri Creek Valley, generally ecological burns happen just at the tail end of summer or in early autumn. When most of the plants have died back to their underground tubers or The grasses are fairly dormant there in their roots. The fire goes through the landscape and removes all the dried out leaves and bits of dead plant matter. And then once we get the rains, those plants re-sprout. Cultural burns can happen at various times of the year. So some of them would happen in autumn, but some of them might happen a bit later as well. They generally don't happen on the same sort of scale as ecological burns, like particularly some of Parks Victoria's burns, they might burn tens of hectares at a time. Cultural burns would happen on a much smaller mosaic kind of scale, so it might just be a few square meters here at a time in sort of a patchwork pattern across the landscape. Some of those could happen when things are still quite dry, but because they're happening on a small scale, they're much more in tune with that fine scale variation of the landscape, of what's actually going on the ground. So some patches might have enough dry matter to be burnt even in the middle of winter. We were fortunate enough at Mary Creek Management Committee to do a cultural burn with the Wurundjeri's Narrap team last year at another grassland in Fawkner, and we were doing that in the middle of July because there hadn't been a lot of rain. There was still some dry material in the landscape, and the areas that we were burning, all the endangered plants hadn't actually started to flower just yet.
So, Michael, on this, just to, again, notice that we're thinking, we've come together today because it's National Threatened Species Day. All these things you're saying about fire, about seasons, about seed, about the scale of a fire, all of this is an impact, isn't it, that we're trying to be so nuanced and careful about how we go about things, that it's all about protecting species.
That's right. So, yeah, I guess the thing about National Threatened Species Day is, although the focus is on individual species, these grasslands themselves are actually a threatened ecosystem. So they're critically endangered in Victoria. They used to be really widespread across the western half of the state, but now less than 1% of them remain for all those reasons we talked about before. So what we're doing now, not only do we have a lot of threatened species living in these grasslands with very particular needs, we also have an ecosystem itself that is critically endangered. So we have to be very particular about the way we manage it to try and make sure we don't push any other plants over the edge, or other animals as well that need those plants, and that we actually can help this ecosystem become healthy and continue to be sustained into the future. So that's a very broad description of the last 400 million years. I guess now we'll actually look at some of the things at Galata Tambor specifically. So some of the threatened species that still call this place home. So when we come over the footbridge into Galata Tambor from Whittlesea Public Gardens, on our left-hand side, we can see these things called Stony knolls, which are the high points in the landscape where there's big piles of rocks, so areas of lava that hasn't been eroded. These really rocky areas, they protect a lot of plants, more so than the surrounding landscape, because cattle and sheep didn't really like to stand on these uneven rocky surfaces, and they are very difficult to crop for exactly the same reason. So they weren't impacted quite as heavily as some of the more surrounding areas by these urbanising processes. These stony knolls, they're really good habitat for a lot of different reptiles, skinks and lizards and snakes living in the gaps amongst the rocks, but also a lot of plants growing in amongst them as well. The plant we can see here is one of the common rice flowers. It's not an endangered species, but it really encapsulates what the stony knoll landscape looks like. But here we actually have a couple of threatened species that live at Galata Tambor and that exist on the stony knolls. The one on the left, the western golden tip, we actually thought it had gone extinct from Galata Tambor. We saw it in the early 2000s and then it disappeared and wasn't seen again for over a decade. But because it's a pea, it actually produces, some of you might be familiar with wattle seed, those really tough, hard-coated seeds produced by wattles. Wattles are in the same family as this western golden tip, and it also produces really tough seeds, and they can actually survive for a remarkable amount of time because of that hard seed coat in the soil. So the Western golden tip, we thought it had gotten extinct from glider tambor, but then a wildfire went through in about 2016 after someone set a car on fire along the freeway. It burnt out the Stony knoll vegetation, and once the rains came along, dozens of these Western golden tips started to pop up from the soil. So they'd just been sitting there in the seed bank as tough seeds, waiting for a fire to come back through. One of the unfortunate things about glider tambor is because it's cut off by the freeway, it's difficult for Parks Victoria to actually get in there and reintroduce ecological burns. So it's only the occasional bit of arson or wildfire, those sorts of things, that allow these essential processes to take place. So the Western golden tip is back at glider tambor. There's about a dozen plants there at the moment that have come up from the soil, and we've been able to collect seed from them and propagate more plants and introduce them to other parts of glider tambor and also to some of the other grasslands in the Mary Creek Valley. This other plant here, slender tick trefoil, is another one of the peas that also is rare in Victoria, and there are dozens of them living on the stony knolls of glider tambor. All of these peas, you'll start to see them in flower. The Western golden tip's probably flowering at the moment or just about to start flowering. So if you're walking over that bridge, have a look on the knoll to your left. Hopefully you'll stumble across it. The slender tick trefoil, those little pink flowers, they start to pop up probably in around December to January, so a bit later in the year. And that's a much tinier plant than the Western golden tip. The slender tick trefoil, that flower is probably only 0.5 centimetre in size. It's just hiding in the cracks amongst the boulders. So you need to tread carefully, walk slowly, and you might find it there.
Can I chip in again, Michael? When you talk to us about these flowers, I think sometimes people are very surprised that our Indigenous biodiversity and our threatened species are just so pretty. So
yeah,
what we're seeing there is yellow and red and pink and very delicate and but they are very tiny, aren't they? So you have to bring your respect into, all of those slides that I showed, or the slide at the very beginning, of very big, grand animals and spaces. What you need to do at a place like glider tambor and with this kind of biodiversity is really start being prepared to look at really tiny things and enjoy that.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. It's because it is, I guess the diversity operates at a really fine scale. So in a grassland like glider tambor, where you might have close to 100 different species of native plant living there, often you might find upwards of 20, 50 plants growing, different types of plants growing, even in just a couple of metres. And because they're only able to do that because they are such tiny little things. So you have to, move with care and be really attentive to find them all hiding away.
Yeah, fantastic.
So we're moving down a bit further now, walking a few hundred metres further south. So we've gone down from the Stony knolls and across the plains, and we enter the edge of an old lava flow. So this is, you can see in the photo how the land sort of drops away in that top right corner. So that's the big basin at glider tambor with the billabongs and Mary Creek just off to the right beyond the edge of the photo. But this area here with these rocks is actually the edge of one of the old lava flows. So you can actually see where lava probably from Hayes Hill up on Donnybrook Road flowed across the landscape, and eventually the volcano slowed down, the lava started to cool, and we got right to the edge of it here. So it's a really distinctive part of the landscape. There's a lot of interesting plants that grow in here as well in this area where it's much more open, but again, it's still really protected from those impacts like grazing and whatever else came before. So here, this sort of, it's kind of called an escarpment shrubland is the name of this ecosystem, which is just another part of the grassland really, but it's another endangered ecosystem. And the plants that grow here aren't necessarily threatened species themselves, but these communities, these assemblages of plants, are certainly critically endangered. This is a curved rice flower, is the yellow thing here that we can see growing amongst these boulders, but there's also quite a few others that we'll look at in a moment. So on the left here, we've got this twining fringe lily. It's a plant that can be found quite widely across Victoria, but in the context of the Mary Creek, it doesn't really exist. Galata Tambor Mary Creek Management Committee, we've been really lucky with Friends of Mary Creek to get some money over the last few years to start dealing with some of the weed problems at Galata Tambor. And while we've been removing all these weeds, we've actually found probably around 50 of these twining fringe lilies growing in amongst the rocks. So we don't know of these plants existing anywhere else in the Mary Creek catchment. So the population of Galata Tambor is, it's really exciting to find this plant there. It's a tiny little delicate thing. So as its name suggests, it twines amongst other things. It almost looks like just a thin green wire. But when the flowers pop out, it's unmistakable because of these beautiful little purple flowers with the fine fringes of hairs around the edges. So Galata Tambor is the only place where this plant grows in the Mary Creek catchment that we're aware of.
Hey, Michael, that's a very beautiful slide, and bringing home that point again about just that the grandeur is really in these tiny things. But because of the way the slide is shown, we can't see the word at the top of the screen. Could you repeat the names of the plants, please?
Yeah, so twining fringe lily is the plant on the left, and magenta stalkspill is the one on the right. And the bit that might be getting cropped at the top of the screen just says lava flow. So that's all you're missing out on there.
Thanks, Michael.
So the magenta stalkspill, which is the one on the right, it's got a similar story to the twining fringe lily in that we only know of a single patch of this plant at Galata Tambor. We're aware of one other population of place where this plant grows in the catchment, and that is now underneath the fruit and veg market on the corner of Cooper Street up there. So, it really highlights how important places like Galata Tambor are. So the only other spot where we know of this plant in the Mary Creek catchment is now beneath a ton of concrete. So these reserves along the Mary Creek are really important for helping make sure things that were once very widespread still are able to survive in the landscape.
Michael, have these got common names as well?
Yeah, so magenta stalkspill is the common name of the one on the right, the pink flowered one, and twining fringe lily is the common name for the other one.
So the one on the right, it looks a bit like a pelargonium. Is that right?
That's right. It is a pelargonium, yeah. So its botanical name is Pelargonium botanum. So it's closely related to the pelargoniums that some of you might have in your gardens, and also the geraniums that you might be familiar with as well. And both it and the fringe lily are actually examples of some of those food plants Aboriginal people would have cultivated. So really starchy roots on the stalkspill and tubers on the fringe lily would have been eaten by the Wurundjeri people's ancestors. And so often when you find these plants in abundance in the landscape, it's a good indication that people were there cultivating these plants at some point long ago, or not so long ago. Another plant that we find growing along the edge of this lava flow is the matted flax lily. Now, this is an endangered species in Victoria. Mary Creek actually happens to be one of the main hotspots for matted flax lily in the state. It's a type of dianella. Some of you might have seen other flax lilies and dianellas around the place or have them in your gardens. Matted flax lily is actually the most common flax lily we find on the Mary Creek, though it is an endangered species. So it grows throughout the grasslands, and it's pollinated by a few different species of native bee. Some of you might have heard of the blue-banded bee. That's a pretty well-known native bee, and some of you might have even seen blue-banded bees in your gardens pollinating native plants, but maybe also your tomatoes or salvias. They seem to really love salvias. So native bees are essential to this matted flax lily to its pollination. The bees that you can see in the photo here aren't actually blue-banded bees. These are another type of native bee called a sweat bee, or sometimes called a mining bee, which are also able to pollinate these plants. So matted flax lilies are a pretty weird plant. They keep their pollen really close to themselves inside those yellow anthers that you can see on the flowers there. And the native bees have to actually grab onto the plant and vibrate themselves at hundreds of vibrations a second in order to burst the pollen out and help to spread it around. And you can, if you look in the photo on the right, it looks like the bees have been pretty busy on those flowers. They're a bit sort of desiccated there, possibly from having their pollen shaken out of them. So these bees are an essential part of this endangered species survival, and so all those things that decimate insect populations, like widespread use of pesticides in agriculture and those sorts of things can potentially impact upon these native bees as well. And then that means it's a problem for these native plants because there's nothing there to pollinate them and help them survive. The Friends of Mary Creek actually had a project focused on the blue-banded bee and this matted flax lily a couple of years ago, which some of you might have heard of, where they were planting out these matted flax lilies at certain distances apart because the bees only travel short distances, a few hundred metres. So if the plants, because we've put roads and houses and whatever else, if the plants, these remnant plants like we find at Galata Tambor, if they're a few hundred metres apart, they don't have the ability for pollen to move from one plant to the other via insects. So Friends of Mary Creek had this blue-banded bee program creating stepping stones between the different grasslands to try and connect them up. So plants less than a few hundred metres apart so that the bees could still move through the landscape from plant to plant.
Michael, is this a great example of a plant that people can put in their own gardens and to offer habitat for these fantastic insects? And is it possible you'd even see a blue-banded bee, which so many people have been excited about in the last few years? Mm-hmm. If you plant these, would you potentially draw blue-banded bees? And if so, what season?
To answer those, there's a few questions there. I guess you can definitely plant this species in your garden, and most of the local Indigenous nurseries. So Kilbundara out at La Trobe University is probably the closest one to the city of Whittlesea, but also Vink down in Fairfield, Western Plains Flora out in Sunbury. They all will have this plant, which you can grow quite easily in your garden. The interesting thing about native bees and blue-banded bees is that they're probably there already. They like to live just in cracks in the dirt. Often they'll live in crumbling mortar of old brick houses. They might actually be there already. And from once it starts to warm up, so maybe late November, you might start to see them around. So it's definitely a good idea to put native plants in your garden, and particularly ones with blue and purple flowers. Those will favour the native bees, drawing the blue-banded bees. But other purple plants as well, like salvias and even ones with white flowers. Some of the eggplants and tomatoes, they seem to really love those as well. So,
and for this plant, for Dianella, Michael, mm-hmm. and when we think about attracting these tiny bees, which are much smaller than your regular honeybee, aren't they? People will be concerned, perhaps, if I plant that in my garden and I attract those bees, will we be more likely to get stung?
Yeah, so, I guess the danger with honeybees being drawn in as well is they could sting you. It's possible. The native bees are stingless, though, or these ones at least are, so there's nothing to worry about there.
That's good.
Yep.
Great.
So we'll move on from the lava flows now, and if we start to wander back up towards the bridge, there's a low point in the landscape between the Stony knolls where the water that falls on the Stony knolls has nowhere to go because it's blocked off by various lava flows. So we get these really wet, boggy areas, which are called gilgais, which is a strange word for just the shallow depressions in the landscape where water pulls up and then dries up in summertime, and we get these tiny little wetlands forming. This is another threatened species. Some of you might have heard of it as murnong, the yam daisy. So this was one of the staple food plants for the Wurundjeri people and other Aboriginal people in Victoria. There's a few different types of murnong around, and some of you might actually be growing these in your gardens as well. But on the volcanic plains, we have a threatened one, a really rare one called plains yam daisy. And at Galata Tambor, there's a tiny little population holding on. So this was one of the plants that sheep really decimated when they were first introduced into Victoria. But at certain places along the Merry Creek, they were mostly only grazed in summer when people were moving stock from one place to another. And in summer, these yam daisies had gone dormant and were tubers underground, so they were able to avoid being eaten by sheep. And yeah, so at Galata Tambor, there are about 10 plants still holding on there. There's a few larger populations elsewhere in the catchment of plains yam daisy, but pretty tiny at Galata Tambor. And to give you an idea of how hard these things are to see, so Merry Creek Management Committee, we had a project focused on the plains yam daisy in the early, from 2010 up until about 5 years ago. Because not many people, there wasn't much, we didn't really know much about this plant and what its life cycle was like, when was the time to look for it, what sort of parts of the landscape does it favour. So we were studying a big population that's up at Kalkello, and based on what we learnt about that population and where it grew in the landscape, what other plants were nearby, we were able to target certain other grasslands and try and search for it there. My colleague and I, we actually spent hours at Galata Tambor systematically going through the wetter areas trying to find this plant, and we had no luck whatsoever. And then my colleague went down to grab a bit of one of the weeds there, onion grass, just to smell it, to smell that onion flavour. But didn't smell anything, so he dropped it back down again. Then he looked down on his foot and he actually saw the flower of a yam daisy that he just absentmindedly plucked from the ground. And there it was. So we'd been searching specifically for it for hours and only found it then by chance. But then were able to thoroughly search that surrounding area, and a wildfire went through the following year. We were able to go back after that and find 10 different individuals. And we've actually had a project in the last couple of years where we've collected seed from the yam daisies at Galata Tambor, but also from yam daisies in other nearby populations. And volunteers at Friends of Merry Creek have actually grown these plants in their backyards and harvested large amounts of seed off them. And then we've been able to work with volunteers from Melbourne Polytechnic, but also from Friends of Merry Creek, to reintroduce the yam daisies back into the landscape. So at Galata Tambor, we've been able to boost the size of the population. There's now a couple of hundred plants growing out there, and we've been able to get them growing in other grasslands as well.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
These stories are just the best, and people are loving them. And it's so great to see, just how, delicate things are, how sturdy they are, and how, a time like National Threatened Species Day, it's just a great reminder to fine-tune what we're thinking about. But I'm also thinking that Josh's reptiles and creatures are getting ready to go on the screen.
That's a good point. So I'm happy to talk more later on if anyone has any questions about the yam daisy. But other than that, I just want to say, get out there once we're able to get back outside again and explore Galata Tambor. There's lots of beautiful things there to be seen. And there's also lots of opportunities to get involved with Merry Creek Management Committee and Friends of Merry Creek. We're hoping to do a number of different working bees out there over the next 6 to 12 months once we're allowed to go out again. So we'd love you to come and help us to help protect these threatened species at Galata Tambor. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I hope to see you out there one day.
And I'm just coming up to that lovely slide now and want to introduce everyone to Josh Cox from Reptile Encounters. He's going to show us some fantastic creatures, because while we think about these plants and we think about the animals, the fact is they all live together. and they all need each other. So thanks, Josh.
Well, thanks for inviting me along, Angela and Michael. So my name's Josh. I'm the director here at Reptile Encounters. I've been passionate about wildlife for a very long time. I was that kid that was always out in the garden looking for garden skinks, and particularly fascinated with reptiles, but I do have a love of all animals. Now, before we kick off, I'm happy if anybody wants to throw your cameras on. I like to try and make this as interactive as possible, and we're doing our best these days virtually. So once upon a time, we were mobile, and our business, we travel out to schools, and we're all about reconnecting people with nature, because I guess we're all familiar now at this day and age. We're spending lots of time in front of screens, in front of cameras. We're spending less time out in the garden or out in the bush. And so we're a little bit disconnected from our environment. And I see this as being a really big problem, because if we're disconnected from our environment, we're not going to be motivated or passionate to go out and protect it. So that's why we do what we do. I've got a few quirky, cool creatures for you to meet today. We're going to start off with an amphibian whose name is Kermit. And he's looking quite cool this morning. And I'll do my best. Obviously, it's tricky with reflections and glass and cameras and all sorts of things, but this is Kermit, one of our growling grass frogs. He's actually quite calm. I might see if I can pick him up and get him up nice and close. There we go. Now, these guys are quite jumpy, so this might not last too long, but this is, Kermit, a growling grass frog. So what we're going to do today, we'll talk about some of their threats, so why they're at risk. Growling grass frogs are endangered, there he goes, in Victoria. And we'll talk about some of the things that are being done to help protect these species. So growling grass frogs, their scientific name is Rhinoidea raniformis. They've actually just changed genus recently. And they're closely related to the green and golden bell frog, Rhinoidea aurea. And some of the reasons that these guys are threatened here in Victoria, firstly, is loss of habitat. Like most, there he goes over the top. Most species are struggling due to a loss of habitat. So that's the first big issue for the growling grass frog. Some of the other issues, there is a fungus called chytrid fungus, which is wiping out our growling grass frogs. And it's also wiping out frogs worldwide. And scientists aren't entirely sure where chytrid fungus came from, but it is a really big problem for our amphibian species. I should say. A few people were asking about indicator species. Frogs are a very good indicator species because they have porous or glandular skin. So they can absorb moisture through their skin. So if there's any pollutants, any issues with the water quality, obviously it's going to impact the frogs. They also have a dual life cycle. So they start out as tadpoles. They start out living in the water. So obviously if there's issues with the water quality, that's also going to affect them at that stage of their reproductive cycle. So that's why you often hear frogs being talked about as an indication or indicator species. So we've talked about habitat, chytrid fungus. There are many more threats. Introduced species are a big one. Now, there's introduced species in the water that obviously eat their eggs, and also the tadpoles, and there are also introduced species on land. So I'm happy if you guys have any comments to pop them in the chat. I'll answer questions as we go today. So does anyone know what introduced species do you think might be a big problem for the growling grass frog? Pop it in the chat. I'd be curious to hear. One of the species I'm thinking about is a pet that a lot of people keep at home. Gambusia, yep, definitely fish. James, that's spot on. A big problem for growling grass frogs. Any other species? So I'm thinking of foxes are a problem, and also cats. So introduced cats. We're not anti-cat people here. We just like to see people being responsible cat owners. So only yesterday, actually, or Friday, we had a nice wattlebird out the front of our building here that had been eaten by a cat. I'd seen a cat only a couple of nights before out in the court. So unfortunately, cats roaming, they are predators, and they do prey on a lot of our native animals, which is very sad. So this wattlebird would come into our front garden because we've got lots of natives, lots of brevelias and bottlebrush that he likes to come in and feed on. And yeah, we found him without his head. So if people can lock up their cats at night time particularly, will be a great thing for a lot of our native species. All right, so another issue for the growling grass frog is segregation or separation of habitat. So obviously these guys live on the ground, so you build a freeway through their habitat, makes it very difficult to get from one side of their habitat to the other. So that is a big issue. Now, in terms of it's not all doom and gloom, there are some good things being done, particularly around Melbourne. Revegetation, there's lots of groups like the Friends of Merry Creek. There's lots of little community groups that go out and revegetate and plant. And we actually take our growling grass frogs along to a lot of those events, so we can actually introduce the species that they're trying to protect and save, which is an awesome thing. Now, if you have a look, you might be able to see he's got quite webbed feet on the back there. They are in the same genus as the green tree frog, but they don't have the sticky pads like a green tree frog. They do have nice golden colours. He's got a nice green band down his back. Sorry, this is quite tricky. You might be able to see. And there he goes. That's why we have the little container. All right, never work with animals and children. Unfortunately, I lucked out there. All right, so that is Kermit. We might move along because we've got quite a few critters to have a look at today and meet. And our next ones are a type of marsupial. Can we handle these frogs? From Jacob. Good question, Jacob. Generally, people recommend if you're handling frogs, you wet your hands first. I've actually got little Kermit there sitting on some nice moist peat, so he's okay. Handle him only a small amount, but generally people suggest you just wet your hands before you handle them. Typically, we don't handle our frogs unnecessarily, or any of our, we only handle them if we need to. Now, the next type of animal we're going to meet today, their names are cinnamon and hot jam. I'll lift them up and see if anybody knows what they are. There we go. And if you have a look in that grass, it might be difficult to see, but one of them is actually curled up in the grass there. So these are a couple of our dun-outs, hence the name cinnamon and hot jam. Smintopsis crassicauda, so crassicauda meaning fat-tailed. Now, dun-outs actually got quite a bit of press recently with the bushfires earlier this year. So the Kangaroo Island dun-out actually didn't fare too well with those bushfires. They have found some subsequently, but they are at risk. In Victoria, the fat-tailed dun-out is classified as near threatened. So unfortunately, we've lost 99% of our grasslands in Victoria, and obviously that has pretty devastating impacts on a lot of species, including these little dun-outs, which I think are pretty gorgeous. So there are 21 species of dun-out found throughout Australia and also New Guinea, and they look kind of mouse-like. They've got long, narrow feet. They are marsupials, so they keep their young in a pouch, and they can have maybe around 8 or 9 young at a time. So that's quite funny when mum's got babies, because you have all these little joeys just hanging off her, which is quite adorable. Now, in terms of threats to these guys, obviously loss of habitat is a big one. They need those grasses to be able to hide in and get away from predators. Introduced species, so cats are a really big problem. A little dun-out would be an easy meal for a cat. And also competition with other rodents as well. So plagues of mice would compete with these little guys for that little niche that they live in, which is a really big problem. So lots of threats. Unfortunately, there's not a lot being done to help these little guys. Obviously, they're not a koala, they're not a wombat, not a Tasmanian devil, so they don't quite get the press or the amount of money that other species might get to try and save them. Now, does anybody have any questions about our little fat-tailed dun-outs? So these guys we actually got from La Trobe Uni. They were doing a breeding program, which was great. So we've got some blood from there and also some blood from a university over in South Australia. And we've had some pretty good success here breeding these little dun-outs. I think we're up to about 21 of them at the moment, which is pretty cool. So they're actually, I didn't mention before, they're carnivorous. So they're from the order Dasyuridae. And so they're related to Tasmanian devils. They're related to spotted quolls. Not quite as fierce, but if they do get annoyed, they'll show their teeth at you and make a little barking sound. But they feed mostly on insects. So we feed them lots of crickets. We have black soldier fly pupae we feed them. Occasionally they'll get donuts. Why are they not called donuts? Yeah, I think it's a cute little name for them, Cara. And someone's just added an image, but I can't see it. So yeah, they're very, very cool little creatures. Not very long lived, so they don't live very long, maybe 1 to 2 years. And yeah, possibly maybe a smidge longer in captivity. So that's the sad thing with all the dasyurids, so including the Tassie devils and the quolls, they don't have a very long life cycle. So yeah, with your Tassie devils might live to 7 or 8 years. Your quolls, you're lucky if they live for maybe 4 or 5 years. So very, very short lifespans for these little guys. All right, no questions. Well, I'll pop him down and we'll move along to our next species. So we're going to look at a reptile now. All right. Does anybody know what this is? Pop it in the chat if you know. All right, so these are a couple of our dragons. There's 2 in here, one's hiding at the back. Okay, as a kid, I often saw these when I was going down to the beach. They like to live in coastal regions. They like to live, in thick grass. And they're a semi-arboreal dragon. So has anyone popped it in? Why is no Sodana active? Good question, not sure, Lucas. One's just having a snooze, the other one's, running around. All right. So yes, we've got James, Jackie Dragon. Well done, James. Jackie Dragon or Jackie Lizard, these guys are known as. So they're a semi-arboreal little dragon found throughout southeastern Australia. Quite a cool little lizard. Generally, they're not that colourful. They do have a yellow mouth, but they're typically just that greyish coloration with that. They've got a crest, a dorsal stripe along their back, little spikes all over their bodies. So these guys would typically live in thick grasses. Obviously, that helps them to avoid predation. Now, in terms of threats to these little dragons, again, I think I've mentioned it many times, but cats are probably the big issue for these little guys. I've seen some studies of cats where they've been opened up and there's been 21 species of animal inside those cats. So we have roughly 25 million cats in Australia, and they eat 75 million native animals every single night. So unfortunately, I hate to be all doom and gloom, but when it comes to wildlife, there's not a lot of fun stats at the moment. So it's a pretty tough world out there. Fortunately, these little guys, the Jackie lizards, are not threatened, which is a good thing. And potentially, and that's because a lot of that coastal habitat is probably still largely intact. But as more and more people venture down to the coast for their holidays, it does increase the pressure on these lizards. So more and more people taking their cats down to their holiday home only adds more pressure for a lot of these species. So that's our little Jackie dragons. So we'll pop them down and we'll move on to the next animal. How big can they grow? Ruby, that's fully grown. They're not a very big dragon. One of them in there slightly larger than the other, but they're probably about 2 years old. So they're basically fully grown. So they would be easy victims for birds and lots of other animals to eat. So that's why they need that thick scrub for them to hide and get away from predators.
While you're getting the next animal, Josh, can I ask a question?
Yep.
Because we started it in Galata Tamboran in the city of Whittlesea, can people expect to see all these animals in Whittlesea, or are we taking a broader look here, thinking about national across Australia for National Threatened Species Day? We're not just at Whittlesea anymore with all these creatures.
No, all species are found in the Victorian volcanic plains, which obviously is quite a broad area, and not necessarily just Whittlesea. So we have here reptile encounters, I think 470 different animals from right around the country. And our next animal is no different. This is Mooney. So Pteropus polyocephalus is the scientific name. Polyocephalus meaning grey-headed. So he's a grey-headed flying fox. Sorry, I didn't bring any food out for you, Mooney. He's very friendly, this guy. Unfortunately, he's the bottom of the pecking order in our colony of grey-headed flying foxes. I think he probably thinks he's more human than bat. So he spends a lot of time in here with us. Now, there are 77 species of bat around the country. Most of those are the microbats that feed predominantly on small insects. There's 4 species of flying fox or megabats. So the grey-headed flying fox is the largest of the megabats. Okay. Unfortunately for bats, they have a very negative reputation. Okay. Unfortunately, people consider them diseased, horrible animals, but I think they're actually quite amazing. And he's going to probably climb all over me, which is going to make my job fun. Okay, so they have a negative reputation because they can have viruses like the coronavirus. Okay, but the only reason that becomes an issue is when we encroach on their habitat. Okay, the only reason the coronavirus got out, if it did come from a bat, was because that bat was at a market. Okay, sitting amongst other animals and probably very, very stressed. So they do carry viruses. In Australia, we have the Australian bat virus, which is probably the cause of their negative reputation here in Australia. But that virus is in less than 1% of bats, and of that 1%, less than 1% will be symptomatic. So your chance of dying from the Australian bat virus is very low. There's only been 1 death in the last 10 years. So most people that work with these bats in captivity will be vaccinated. It's a rabies vaccination, which does protect you from that virus. All right, Mooney, I really should have got him some food because he's going to make my life very, very tricky. But what you might be able to see is that awesome membrane. So it goes basically in between his hands, and he's got that membrane which he uses to fly, fully stretched. It can actually stretch out 1 meter, which is pretty awesome. So they are huge. Now, in terms of why these guys are so critical to our environment, they are pollinators. Okay, they pollinate most of our eucalypts around the country. So without them, most of those eucalypt forests aren't going to have anything to pollinate. And also they pollinate a lot of the food that we eat as well. And one in particular is the bananas. So without these bats, we'd be really missing a trick in terms of pollination. So how they do that, they stick their heads into the flowers, the pollen gets all over their face, and then they can actually fly hundreds of Ks. So that's why they're important. They can spread that pollen for hundreds of Ks, which is why it's so important for the forests. Now, in terms of threats, obviously, habitat loss or habitat destruction is a key threat to this species. In Australia, we have a very, very high rate of habitat destruction. We lose an area the size of the MCG every 3 minutes, and we've been doing that for decades. So in terms of their habitat, we've been removing it very, very quickly. And unfortunately, it takes a very long time for a eucalypt or a gum tree to grow. So you can't replace their habitat quickly. And if you only have to think back to February when we were in the midst of our bushfires, we lost 18 million hectares of habitat. Okay, 18 million hectares. This country only has about 150 million hectares. Okay, and we just lost 18 of them. So well over 10% of habitat for our wildlife was lost in only the space of a few months. Now, the concerning thing for me is obviously with the coronavirus, we've pretty quickly forgotten about the bushfires and we've moved on to the next problem without actually doing a great deal about climate change and those fires. So that's probably the biggest threat. Unfortunately, they're not a cute species like a koala, so there isn't a lot being done to help protect them. Most people are trying to run them out of their towns. Now, in terms of where you'll find them, there is a big colony at Yarra Bend. It's the second biggest colony in Victoria. The biggest one is down in East Gippsland. So that's where they're found. It is amazing when you see them of an evening flying back in over the Yarra River. He's just made an exit. So yeah, they are really gorgeous. And if you ever see them coming down for a drink, I think that's pretty amazing. They swoop down, they wet their chest on the river, on the water, and then they drink the water off their own chest, which is quite cool. All right, well, I think Mooney's just decided he's going to climb all over me. So what we might do, we might pop him down and we'll move on to our next animal. Great to see some positive bat press in these times. Thanks, Heidi. All right, so our next animal that we're going to meet, his name is Spike. All right, here he is. And Spike is a Cunningham lizard or a Cunningham skink. Okay, and these guys are found all the way from central Queensland down to the southeast of South Australia. And generally these guys live in rocky outcrops. They'll live in between the rocks and they like to live in little family groups. Okay, so they're quite a robust little skink, quite a spiky tail. I bring that up nice and close. And they live in a little family group and the parents will actually protect their young, which is quite unusual for a reptile species to have that maternal instinct. So I've heard reports of parents wedged between the rocks and they'll be protecting their babies from brown snakes and other animals that are trying to come and eat them. So again, another species that has been impacted by the loss of habitat, the loss of grasslands here in Victoria. They're not threatened at the moment, but there are reports of inbreeding because of separation of their habitat. So there's a bit of research being done on these guys in the Mount Lofty ranges, and they are finding that there is inbreeding happening because of that separation of habitat. So obviously when their colonies get broken up, their genetic diversity is impacted because of that. So the more wildlife corridors that we can create, it helps to benefit all of our wildlife. So that is your Cunningham skink. They feed on insects, they feed on fungi, they feed on berries, flowers. They're an omnivorous little lizard, quite similar, I guess, to a blue-tongue lizard. Now,
can I ask you a question again, Josh?
Yep.
Some people will look at a blue-tongue lizard and this little guy in your hand and they fancy that this is a good creature to have as a pet. And so they want to take them out of their habitat and keep them at home. Looks like a lovely creature to handle. But what is your ecological message there for people who want to take these creatures and have them as pets?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm not anti people keeping wildlife as pets. We do not need to remove them from the wild, and it is illegal to remove them from the wild because there is a big population in captivity. So Spike here was captive bred. I think he originated at Lilydale High School. They have a really good breeding program out at Lilydale High School. So I'm all for kids keeping blue-tongue lizards, keeping these skinks and getting that love of nature like a lot of my idols did. So, you know, I've always looked up to people like Steve Irwin and David Attenborough. And when they were young, they were, you know, keeping all sorts of animals and that fostered their love and passion for wildlife, and they went on to do great things. So I know the laws are pretty strict now, and that's for a good reason. We can't be taking these animals from the wild, and particularly now that their numbers are so low in the wild as well. So, yeah, we're definitely pro keeping native animals, obviously keeping them to a very high standard, giving them a natural enclosure, giving them lots of enrichment, great food, keeping them healthy. Saying that, Angela, not all Cunninghams are nice and friendly like Spikey. He's a bit of an exception. A lot of them, yeah, don't want to be handled and don't want to have a bar of us. So, yeah, the reason I pulled him out is because he is quite chilled and quite calm.
You guys are friends.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, he does have a keeper here, Caitlin, who absolutely adores him, and she walks around with him on her shoulder all day long. So, yeah, not obviously with animals, they're wild animals. They do have their own personalities. Some are chill, some are not, and that's fine. You know, we don't need to change that. Yeah, so I think I think it is great for kids to be passionate about native species. Okay, I think kids keeping cats and dogs and guinea pigs, while that has benefit, obviously there's health benefits to spending time around animals. I'd prefer them learning about our native species because if they're passionate about the Cunningham skink or they're passionate about the Jackie lizard, they're going to want to protect that habitat, protect those species, and be a voice for those animals. Okay, so that's why I think it's important that kids take a real interest in our native wildlife. And unfortunately, you know, kids grow up and they learn about elephants and lions and tigers and all these exotic species, but they don't necessarily learn about what we have here in our own backyard. And that means it's easier for us to ignore what's happening with habitat. It's easier for us to ignore climate change and all these environmental issues because we're just not that connected to it. We know about palm oil and the orangutans, but we don't know about the deforestation that's happening right here in Victoria.
Yes, that's where you and Michael and me are, we hope that, I think probably all the people who've joined us here today probably feel a lot like we do, but for some people we don't know, they mightn't have really thought that through. So it's very hard to protect something that you don't know and that you can't name. How can you take care of it, or if you can't understand it or even know it?
Yeah, exactly. And then they're not all cute, fluffy, So yeah, we've got to be a voice for all species. Now we have one more animal to meet that I think everyone will be very familiar with. Just give me 2 seconds as I reach down and grab him. All right, where are you, Houdini? So this is Houdini, and this is the species of lizard that probably got me into this business. Passionate about reptiles. This is your eastern blue-tongued lizard. So as a kid, I was just enamored. I was obsessed with blue-tongued lizards. I wanted to make massive enclosures out of my backyard so I could have blue-tongued lizards out there and just watch them all day. So they are an amazing little guy. You can see that bright blue tongue poking out. His name is Houdini because he's often managed to push the doors of his enclosure out and escape the enclosure and disappear for weeks, and then eventually we would just find him sitting in the sun somewhere. So that's where the name came from. So Taliquus sconoides is the scientific name. And here in Victoria, we have eastern blue tongues, and we also have the lowland and the alpine blotched blue tongues as well. So the blotched blue tongues have a slightly different patterning along their backs. Now, these guys are not threatened with extinction, but in my opinion, I definitely see less of them in the wild now than I did when I was younger. I remember, going on holidays over Christmas, and you'd often see blue-tongued lizards wherever you're out camping, but you just don't see them as frequently anymore. And I put that down to a couple of things. Cats probably being the main thing, but also a lot of them getting run over by vehicles is also another issue. So obviously reptiles like to come out and sit on the roads of an evening and get nice and warm and often get run over by cars. So that is a big issue. So does anybody have any questions? If you want to pop them in the chat, or even if you want to unmute yourself, if any of the kids want to ask anything about Houdini here, I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Okay, so these are an omnivorous lizard. So that means he feeds on snails, slugs, insects, fruit and vegetables. We give our reptiles here quite a variety of foods to keep them nice and healthy. Angela mentioned keeping these in captivity. You can keep blue-tongued lizards in captivity. The strange thing about the licensing here in Victoria is you don't need a license to keep one of these guys, even though it's probably the lizard you're most likely to find in your backyard. So that's a bit perplexing. But anyway, you can keep a blue-tongued lizard. Make sure you do your research, because reptiles do have some particular requirements. So they need somewhere to bask. So to mimic the basking in the sunshine, they need access to UV. And they also need calcium and vitamin D3 in their diets as well.
Josh, there is a nice couple of questions about why you would call this creature Houdini. And I know at Mary Creek Management Committee, one of my colleagues had a blue-tongued lizard in an enclosure for a while, and it was always very carefully finding the potential places where it could leave, and would work hard with those tiny little arms, scratch, 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 and then it would go to the next place where it was maybe a break in the glass, the edge of the door, or a breathing hole. And it made me think that this was one really smart creature.
Yeah, well, Houdini, I think on a couple of occasions has escaped from his enclosure, and we have a big 400 square metre warehouse here, and he'll go missing, but he'll turn up eventually. So that's where the name Houdini came from. Must have been pretty early on when we got him that he escaped on us. I can't remember, we might have a couple of eastern blue-tongued lizards here, but we've got a few of the alpines and also blotched blue-tongued lizards and some western blue-tongued lizards as well. So generally, if I was doing a threatened species program, I'd either use a western or a central blue-tongued lizard. And again, being a blue-tongued lizard, unfortunately, there's not a lot of research. There's not a lot of data on why their numbers are declining or why they're disappearing. But I think definitely the feral predator issue here in Australia is a big one. So yeah, it's pretty hard for these guys to survive. With feral cats, there's reports of cats getting up to 26 kilos in Central Australia. So yeah, it's the size of my stuffy at home. So yeah, no reptile is going to be able to stand up to a 26 kilo killing cat. So not to be anti-cat, but it is a really big problem here in Australia. And another issue that really there's not a great deal being done about that at the moment, which is a little bit sad. So any other questions? Not about lizards, but will you be showing us any of the snakes today? I'd love to show you snakes, but I didn't have any that were native to the area. And the snakes we have here in Victoria are all venomous, so that would also make my job a little bit tricky. Yeah, we do have probably, we've got about 40 pythons here. We do have one venomous snake. It's a brown tree snake, so he's only mildly venomous, but yeah, all the others are pythons. So it didn't fit in with today's talk, but I'm sure at another occasion I'll be able to pull out some snakes for you.
Fantastic. Josh, I'm going to stop screen sharing then if you're at the end.
Yep.
And then we'll be getting close to winding up. We've had lots of, I love the way everyone's asked questions all the way through, and it's made it the time together so kind of friendly. So there's that last slide from Josh about how to find reptile encounters. And I have to say, you know, there's a few different businesses out there that do this kind of work, but our favourite is for Merri Creek Management Committee, we really love reptile encounters. So I don't think you could have done a better job for us today, Josh. It's just so beautiful, the way you are with animals and all the things you have to say. So I've just got this slide up that was just in general to prompt us to think about how we might enjoy talking about Indigenous biodiversity. And in that slide, I put together a lot of pictures because at Merri Creek Management Committee, we do a lot of work with community engagement and education, and that's the field that I specialise in. And you can see that when we're out with kids in schools, there's a whole lot of ways to learn about what plants grow near you. Sometimes we print them, we paint them, we draw them, we sketch them, as well as looking at animals. The figuring out these relationships between plants and animals is so important. So there will be some of you who are watching today who are thinking about homeschooling, and we want to encourage you to think about looking at this video again. You might want to incorporate what we've recorded here and what you've heard here today in your homeschooling activities in the future. But you might like it as a research resource at any level, whether it's primary, secondary or tertiary level. There's a lot of information, and I hope leads as well, that you can always reach back to Merri Creek Management Committee, to Reptile Encounters, as you think about nature and your neighbourhood. And this is the last slide. I will go back to chat and see if anything has popped up in questions, but I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today and hope that you can visit Galata Tambor one day. But also, we always want to encourage you to think about making a link to the Grasslands at your home garden and at school. So the question is going to be asked, when can you next experience home on Wurundjeri country in Whittlesea's Grasslands? And of course, for those of you, for example, in Thomastown who are within that 5K radius, go there now. That's what I think. For many of us, it's one of our very favourite places. And when I've taken friends and family there who are visiting Melbourne, and it's only a 20-minute drive from my place in Preston, when we take photos and people show them to their mates later and they say, "Where do you think I was?" they sometimes assume they were in Central Australia. It is a really magic place, and you can feel that you're really getting away from it all. Otherwise, watch out for our guided walks and talks and the working bees that we sometimes are able to run at Galata Tambor. You can watch out on our website, and I've put that address there today. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and just come back onto, as we wind up our time together. I think we're 5 minutes over. There's a lot of people just said in chat saying thanks to Michael and thanks to Josh. And I hope that it's been a successful time. And I feel that we have been so interactive that, you know, we've been able to follow up the questions and answers all the way through. So on that note, Michael and Josh, shall we say goodbye?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. It's been, sorry, Josh. Yeah, it's been great getting a chance to share some of the wonders of Galata with you all. And yeah, keep an eye on our website. We're planning to do quite a lot of work out there over the next little while, and we'd love to have you all help us look after the place.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for jumping on. Feel free to jump across to our Facebook page to see where, we've got lots of events coming up, particularly with the school holidays coming up. And I know people are looking for things to do while they're trapped indoors. So definitely you can follow what we're doing there. So thanks for joining.
And, you know, we just, you can begin a session like this with an acknowledgement of country, but I'm going to close today with that acknowledgement of country and say that we pay our respects to Wurundjeri elders past, present and future. We always love going out on Wurundjeri country with Wurundjeri community, and we get to do that in all kinds of projects and at different times. And there are times in which we have Wurundjeri elders with us who will do that welcome to country with a proper Tanderum ceremony with a fire and be able to walk through the smoke. So we all look forward to when we can all do that together again in the future. And it probably won't be too far away. So stay calm, enjoy yourselves, enjoy whatever you can around you, and try and plant some Dianella. Okay, signing off, I think we'll conclude there. Thanks, everybody.